Chapter 1, What's with Wicca?
Ah, yes.
Before setting out on our path, it's probably prudent to have some idea of where the journey will take you. Hence our beginning this book by taking a look at the neo-pagan religion of Wicca. We will provide a brief history along with a quick who's who of the movers and shakers of the craft and their contributions that they have made to shape it into the religion we know today. Finally, we will consider why Wicca, with its roots planted firmly in the past, is becoming increasingly relevant in modern society.
Indeed.
The craft of the wise. As we use this term extensively throughout this book, it's probably a good idea to start by explaining exactly what it is. The craft of the wise, often shortened to just the craft, derives its title from the same Anglo-Saxon Wicca, which gave rise to the name Wicca, as you'll learn later in the chapter, means wise one or witch. The word craft implies particular skills and knowledge, usually learned over a period of time. Although the title Wicca and the craft of the wise are largely interchangeable, we have a strong affinity for the latter, as it subtly conveys the need for dedication and study to gain the skills and knowledge required to effectively practice your craft. What exactly is Wicca?
I hear you ask.
Wicca per se is defined as a neo-pagan religion, although some would say that it's far more than a mere religion, and to describe it as such actually denigrates the craft.
You could argue.
Nonetheless, there can be no denying the fact that Wicca has become officially recognized as a religion by governments the world over. Depending upon your viewpoint, that designation might be for better or worse, but it does at least offer some degree of protection from religious discrimination under the law, or at least in theory. Your mileage may vary. Unfortunately, being legally entitled to practice your religion is no guarantee that you will not be subject to discrimination. Sometimes it's best to apply wisdom contained within the witch's pyramid, to know, to will, to dare, to keep silent, and know when to keep your mouth shut, and your personal beliefs just that, personal. Now that we've established that Wicca can be properly described as a neo-pagan religion, we come to what makes Wicca what it is, and how it differs from other pagan religions. It certainly would not be unreasonable observation to say that there are many great different flavors of Wicca.
Oh, heck yeah.
But rather than get bogged down in the mind-boggling array of differences, let us try to focus on the similarities. There are many variants in other religions too. Within Christianity, there are Catholics and Methodists and Lutherans and Anglicans and Protestants and Baptists and Evangelists and Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses and Seventh-day Adventists and many, many more.
Yes.
One could probably write a book about the differences between these faiths, but they all have one thing in common: the belief in Christ. So what's the common thread running through Wicca? What are its similarities? While there will always be exceptions, it would be reasonably accurate to describe Wicca as an earth-based, following nature, polytheistic, more than one god or goddess, neo-pagan, new pagan religion. There are some words here that warrant further explanation.
She just did it.
We've already discussed religion, but what of neo-paganism? The prefix neo comes from the Greek neos, meaning new. Hence, neo-pagan could be interpreted as a new or revised form of paganism. We are then brought to the word pagan. It should be made clear that the terms pagan and Wiccan do not mean the same thing.
I definitely don't.
Certainly all Wiccans are pagan, but not all pagans are Wiccan. The word pagan was originally a Latin term Romans used during early Christianity as a derogatory term for people who lived outside of the cities, country dwellers, who knew naught of civilization and then the fashionable new religion. Similarly, the term heathen also originally referred to folks who dwelled on the heath, although this word is now more commonly used to describe followers of the Nordic neo-pagan or reconstruction tradition such as Asatru. Despite its original use, the Roman slur seems to have stuck for a great many followers of the revealed religion. The term pagan has since come to refer to almost any spiritual belief or practice outside of the scope of the mainstream Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. However, this usage is kind of a gross simplification, as there are more than 5,000 religions or spiritual practices in the world today, few of which would really identify themselves as pagan.
It's true. It's true.
I'm just wondering how we
You want me to carry on
like I wanted to try to get
to chapter 1,
to
maybe chapter 3.
To page 53.
We could probably do that. Do that. Yeah.
So we'll see how you go.
So do you want me to carry on?
Yeah, we'll go back and forth a few pages.
So polytheistic and polytheism simply refer to the practice of honouring many gods, as Lisa said earlier. Although traditional Wicca could equally be viewed as being duotheistic, insomuch as it honours both the god and the goddess. That said, there are forms of Wicca, such as Dianic Wicca, that honour only the goddess, but that's not what we're going to cover here. I can't. I have the wrong equipment.
Hey.
Within traditional Wicca, the god represents the divine masculine and is typically represented by the sun, whereas the goddess represents the divine feminine and is represented by the moon and or Mother Earth. Rather than an overarching and somewhat vague description, e.g. the divine, it is typically common for Wiccans to honour specific deities within their rites and rituals, particularly in a group setting. Repeatedly working with the same deities can be a great benefit in building a closer working relationship. Though it's covered more deeply in Chapter 7, in our tradition we honour Cerridwen, and we put in this book Cernunnos, but it's actually Gwyn ap Nudd. That's the Welsh name we use.
We just didn't want people to go crazy.
So we just let you know that it's Gwyn ap Nudd, all right? It's also worth mentioning that something that continues to remain a source of debate amongst Wiccans, namely whether the deities are gods and goddesses in their own right, i.e. true polytheism, or actually aspects of a single god, goddess, or divine essence, known as henotheism. Don't worry, we're not going to ask you to take sides. As far as we're concerned, this is a matter for your personal conscience and has no bearing on your ability to form a close working relationship with your chosen deities. Having covered the polytheistic, neo-pagan religion part of this description, we now come to the earth-based bit. In essence, this is what truly makes Wicca what it is. As we've discussed, there are many other polytheistic pagan religions that differ widely from Wicca. As you progress along this path, you'll come to realise that there are so many forms of Wicca that differ substantially from each other. However, the common thread that ties them all together is the natural rhythms or cycles of the earth, more specifically the movement of the sun and moon in relation to the earth. We now know from scientific observation that the Earth is a spherical planet that orbits around the Sun at the centre of our solar system, not a flat patch of ground where the sun rises in one part of the sky and sets in another, as our ancient predecessors once believed.
Yeah, I don't think many flat earthers are Wiccan, but anyway.
You never know. Incidentally, the geocentric, i.e. Earth-based model, was the official position of the Catholic Church right up until 1992, when Pope John Paul II officially accepted the findings of Galileo and granted him pardon for the crimes of heresy. Galileo had...
John Paul himself was quite the heretic, I think. Yeah.
Well, it takes a heretic to pardon a heretic, I don't know.
There you go.
All right, Galileo had deduced that the Earth was not the centre of the universe, as the Church had claimed, but was a planet moving around the sun, something he was forced to recant under threat of torture before the Inquisition in 1633.
So
How wonderful is it?
1992 before the Catholics said the earth wasn't flat.
We're going to tell you what you believe. Right, good. Nonetheless, we see from where we're standing, so it makes sense to look at this movement from a geocentric viewpoint. Accordingly, Wicca honours the never-ending dance of sun and moon in constant chase across the sky, the ceaseless ebb and flow of longer days and shorter nights manifest in the endless cycle of the seasons. This Wheel of the Year, as it is known, is celebrated at sabbats, special ceremonies marking key points throughout the year. The cycles of the moon are celebrated at sabbats, ceremonies honouring a particular phase of the moon in relation to the Wheel of the Year. Although some traditions may only honour the sabbats, and even that number may vary, as some Wiccan traditions only celebrate the 4 major ones, this practice is the common thread running through Wicca. So, before we dive into the history of Wicca, it's important we address the subject of witchcraft. Dun dun dun. It's fair to say that even today the word witch strikes fear in the hearts of a good many people. Ever since the late medieval period, when the Church officially recognised the existence of witches and granted full papal approval for the establishment of an inquisition to seek out and eliminate their kind, witches have been the subject of relentless fear-mongering, culminating in a widespread moral panic that spawned the witch trials of the 16th to 18th centuries. Even though the mass hysteria of the burning times has long since passed, witches and witchcraft are still perennial favourites for the writers of horror films to this very day.
The 70s really took a...
Yeah. We apologise if you're one of those people for whom the word witch triggers a deep-seated anxiety, but there really is no way to sugarcoat this. Wicca is modern witchcraft. In common with the theme that all Wiccans are pagan, in our mind, and certainly within our tradition, all Wiccans are witches. On the other hand, however, not all witches are Wiccan. It's certainly possible for someone to practice folk magic or witchcraft without Wicca's religious or spiritual component. But as you progress through this book, you'll see for yourself that it is impossible to follow the path of Wicca without practicing magic. Even if you never cast a spell in your life, the very rites and rituals that form the craft of the wise are acts of natural and sympathetic magic in and of themselves. That said, we've both met more than one person who claimed to be Wiccan, but definitely not a witch. We can only assume the word witch has such negative connotations for them that the denial is the only available option. Denial works for them.
That river in Egypt.
Ah, yes.
All right. History of the craft. Although it draws upon innate wisdom and knowledge, perhaps as old as time itself, it might surprise you to learn that the Wiccan religion we know today is actually quite modern.
That it is.
So it does draw upon wisdom and ancient knowledge, but it is quite modern. There is much debate about who originally coined the term Wicca, but there can be no doubt as to who brought it to the attention of the world in the latter half of the 20th century. An oddly eccentric and rather well-to-do Englishman by the name of Gerald Brasseur
Gardner, yes.
Brasseur.
I think we can afford to let the blood course more freely.
Gerald Gardner, who lived from 1884 to 1964. He was a Gemini, by the way. It is fair to say that virtually every Wiccan tradition in existence today has its roots in Gardnerian Wicca. For this reason, Gerald Gardner has come to be known as the father of modern witchcraft. Gardner was born to wealthy parents who had a business in the timber trade. The firm, which specialized in the import of exotic hardwoods, had been founded by his father's great-great-grandfather, Edmund Gardner, a fellow who had managed to successfully climb a social ladder to the point where he was awarded the rare honor of becoming Freeman of the City of Liverpool, a title that in the context of the mid-18th century was a rare honor indeed. It recognized that he held that he had escaped the drudgery of serfdom and elevated himself to become a respected member of the landed gentry. Sufficient to say Gerald Gardner was the epitome of old money.
Oh, and that he was.
That is not to say that Gerald's childhood was a particularly easy one, for he was quite sickly and suffered from bouts of acute asthma, a condition seriously exasperated by the polluted atmosphere of the heavily industrial Lancashire in which he lived. The dense winter smog was especially hard for him. In common with wealthy upper-middle-class children of the day, Gardner was largely raised by his nanny rather than his parents. In Gardner's case, it was a young Irish woman by the name of Josephine Maccombie, whom he affectionately called Com. Although there is much conjecture surrounding her true motives, Com offered to take the child to warmer climates in order to ease his suffering, albeit at his father's expense. So, travel they did, so extensively that Gerald never actually received a formal education nor attended school. But being a determined sort, he taught himself to read and write, and did he ever love to read. One of his favorite and most influential books was There Is No Death by Florence Marryat, a book that propounded the immortality of the soul. He found this subject matter captivating. I would say that another common thread with almost every Wiccan is that they believe in reincarnation. Around the turn of the 20th century, Com met her soulmate, David Elkington, in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, and decided to marry him. Elkington ran a highly successful tea plantation.
Tea.
So it was agreed that the young Gerald should continue to reside with the newly married couple and learn the tea trade. Com and her new husband, David, set up a home in Kandy, a city that, aside from being one of the most spiritually revered places within the Buddhist faith, was also literally right next door to a famous, or depending upon your point of view, notorious, neighbor, Aleister Crowley. Their being neighbors was something that would prove to be highly significant in the coming years. Most all of us who come to this path can, upon reflection, identify the one pivotal point where we began to question all that we've been taught in our formative years and even begin to reject our conditioning. We all kind of come with a you learn what you live core religion, but there's some point when you start to question.
Is that right?
In Gerald Gardner's case, it was at this exact point in his story where we believe he encountered his personal tipping point and began to reevaluate the core tenets of his beliefs. For the sake of expediency, we'll largely gloss over Gardner's working life and fast forward to his retirement when things really got busy. Suffice to say that he had moved in the right circles and rubbed shoulders with some interesting people and gained a strong interest in folklore, history, archaeology, anthropology, and spiritualism. On her husband's retirement from the civil service in Malaya, Gerald's wife, Donna, persuaded them to return to England, where they eventually settled in the village of Highcliffe, Hampshire, on the southern fringe of New Forest. Put a pin there. Gardner quickly found that the colder climate really didn't suit him, and soon he started to develop issues with his health. His doctor suggested that he try nudism.
Get your kit off.
And although Gerald was initially skeptical, he found that it really did cure what ailed him and quickly became a strong proponent for this practice. It was also in Highcliffe that Gerald had a brief flirtation with Rosicrucianism, but quickly became disenchanted with the group's leader. Nonetheless, he struck up a strong friendship with a few of its members of the group who kept to themselves for the most part. He soon learned that these were the members of the New Forest Coven, and believed them to be one of the last surviving covens of an ancient witch cult that predated Christianity. It's probably worth pointing out that this was on about 1939. Witchcraft was still illegal in Britain under the Witchcraft Acts of 1735. Accordingly, the members of the coven very much kept themselves to themselves out of necessity.
Indeed.
Eventually, Gardner won their trust, and on one fateful night in September 1939, he was taken by the coven to the home of old Dorothy Clutterbuck.
Who actually wasn't that much older than him, but that's by the by.
Hey. Where he was stripped naked and led through an initiation ritual into the craft. It was partway through this ritual that he'd heard the term Wicca, which he recognized from his studies as Old English to mean witch. Gardner himself did not use the term Wicca to refer to the practice of the New Forest Coven, or even the group he subsequently founded. But it's at the point of his initiation where the word starts to take on some special significance. Following his initiation, Gerald continued to explore other avenues of spirituality. Naturism remained an important practice for him, and he regularly attended a nudist colony near Bricketwood in Hertfordshire. It was here that he met and became close friends with Ross Nichols.
Ross Nichols, eh?
Gardner had become fascinated with Druidry, having recently joined an ancient Druid order, and introduced Ross to the religion. This meeting would prove to be highly significant. Ross Nichols became enraptured with Druidry and went on to become a chairman of the ancient Druid order, branching out to found the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids.
So at the end of the World War II, Gardner and his wife decided to up sticks from Hampshire and move to Bricket Wood. Gerald had purchased the former 4 Acres Naturist Club, of which he used to be a member, along with an adjoining plot of land he renamed 5 Acres. That was brilliant, wasn't it?
Inspired.
Truly inspired. Revolutionary thinking.
All right.
He also, and this is quite
wild,
the story of this, I haven't got time to go into it, but it's amazing. He also acquired a 16th century witch's cottage that he arranged to be dismantled, shipped to, and reassembled on the site. Fearing that the old religion, as he termed it, might die out, he formed his own coven to meet at the witch's cottage in Bricket Wood, from where he eagerly started to seek out new members. It was about this time when he reconnected with an old friend he'd met before the war, Arnold Crowther, a performing magician who worked magic with a C, as in pulling a rabbit from a hat, as opposed to high magic with a K, meaning ceremonial magic. Despite Crowther's stage magic, he did also have some serious connections with high magic as well. Crowther introduced Gardner to a friend of his, the occultist Aleister Crowley, the very same person to whom he'd quite literally lived next door to while residing in his adolescent home
There's
in Candy.
always wild synchronicities on the path.
Isn't there? Recognising Crowley's wealth of esoteric knowledge and wishing to glean as much as he could from this venerable high magician, he quickly struck up a friendship. For his part, Crowley believed that Gardner might be able to help revive the ailing British branch of the Ordo Templi Orientis, the OTO, of which Crowley was the head. Accordingly, he raised Gerald to the 4th degree within the order and passed on a veritable trove of information describing their rites and rituals. There was some talk of Gardner becoming head of the British branch of the OTO, but for a number of reasons this
did
not
want
come
to orient
pass.
himself to the east.
However, Crowley's material did not go to waste. It became, according to those who knew, the basis of Gardner's first book of shadows, Ye Book of Ye Art Magickal. So there. As Gardner's wife Donna had no interest in witchcraft, so we're told, he persuaded Edith Woodcraft Grimes, the member of Woodford Grimes, the member of the New Forest Coven into which Gardner had been initiated, to become the high priestess of his new Bricketwood Coven. Incidentally, the Bricketwood Coven, the very first in the Gardnerian line, being centred in 1946, still exists and is active to this very day, although they no longer meet in the witch's cottage.
Or not.
Who's to say?
There are still some original Gardnerians hanging around.
Before long, Gerald and Edith, whom he referred to by her magical name Dafo, had begun to initiate others into the craft. Nonetheless, Gardner was still deeply concerned that the craft was in perilous decline, and redoubled his efforts to ensure its survival. Given that witchcraft was still illegal, he found himself in a somewhat of a quandary on how best to do this. Eventually, he devised a plan to publicise the craft by writing a book called High Magick's Aid under the pen name of Skyer, which was published by the Atlantis Bookshop in London. Still there.
I think it just celebrated its 103rd anniversary, if I'm not mistaken.
It's a wild bookshop, it truly is.
Crowley and Dion Fortune and
there's lots
Pamela
of
Coleman
interesting
Smith
people been there.
Yeah.
While ostensibly a work of fiction set in the 12th century, the book details actual magical workings.
All right, so High Magick Aid.
High Magick's Aid. You should read it. You really should. Because considering this guy taught himself to read and write, it's not too shabby,
No.
I have to say. It's got a good plot line. In 1951, the Archaic Witchcraft Act of 1735 was repealed by Parliament, and it was
Look out.
no longer against the law to be a witch. So, Gardner started to actively court the press in an attempt to bring renewed vigour to the old religion by generating interest in the craft. Unfortunately, this move was met with disdain bordering on hostility by some members of the New Forest Coven,
Who wanted to stay in the closet.
still very much wanted to keep themselves to themselves. Nonetheless, it did bring Wicca to the attention of a woman by the name of Doreen Valiente, who'd recently attained the ripe old age of 30.
Through her Saturn return, wasn't
Having
she?
just endured her first Saturn return.
Yeah.
The planet of restriction and karmic lesson, Saturn takes about 29.5 years to make a complete cycle of your natal chart, an event called a Saturn return. This event marks the point where we reap what we've sown and may result in some difficult life lessons. Even the glyph, which I can't pronounce, looks like a chair. Sit down, because you're going to learn something. It does look like a chair, if you don't know. You could draw it in the air for them. Or not.
It just looks like an H.
All right then, with a chair.
A lowercase h.
So, Valiente had developed a deep interest in the occult following the end of World War II, and was familiar with the work of historian, anthropologist and folklorist Margaret Murray, who had put forward the theory of the existence of a pre-Christian witch cult she termed the Old Religion. On learning that there may still be pockets of this surviving to the very day, Doreen's interest was certainly piqued. She wrote to Gerald, and they began a correspondence that would last for several months before Gardner agreed to meet her. The meeting was to take place at the home of Edith Woodford Grimes, Dafo, in Hampshire, and in the summer of 1953, Doreen Valiente was initiated into the coven by Gerald Gardner. Valiente quickly rose through the ranks to become High Priestess, eventually replacing Dafo, Woodford Grimes, who had become increasingly frustrated by Gardner's constant publicity seeking. Doreen's initiation into Wicca was to be truly a pivotal event, for her contribution to the craft is of immense importance. While Gerald Gardner has been called the father of modern witchcraft, Doreen Valiente has come to be known as its mother. Valiente had an uncanny gift for poetry, recognising the obvious Crowley influence
Yeah,
upon Gardner's
she was
Book of Shadows.
Oh, this is Crowley.
Ye boke of ye art magical. She took it upon herself to almost completely rewrite it. She replaced much of the arcane and somewhat stuffy language focused on the ceremonial magic component with beautiful and evocative poems that drew more upon the emotional aspect of the craft as well as the nature of nature itself. Some say that Valiente brought a woman's touch to the previously largely misogynistic realm of high magic to create the unique blend of masculine and feminine qualities that form the Wicca we know today.
Form, force.
Certainly the rites and rituals within our own tradition would not be so emotionally engaging and deeply moving were it not for her. One of her best known pieces is The Charge of the Goddess, a work that is both profoundly moving and deeply magical. There shall ye assemble, ye are fain to learn all sorcery, yet have not won its deepest secrets. To these will I teach things that are as yet unknown. This poem is used by Wiccan groups the world over. In fact, we ourselves often read The Charge of the Goddess as part of our own rites and rituals. We've included the entire poem, by kind permission of the Doreen Valiente Foundation, in Chapter 8. Although this and other pieces of her work, such as the Witch's Chant, also known as the Witch's Rune, and the Witch's Creed, also known as the Wiccan Reed, have become cornerstones of the craft, sadly her name is not so widely recognised, at least as yet. While Gerald Gardner is credited as being the founding father of Wicca, we would respectfully suggest that without the contributions of this incredible woman, Wicca would simply not be where it is today. But why do we call Wicca Wicca? It's worth taking a look at the etymology of the word witch at this point. As far as we can tell, it came into common usage in the early Middle Ages circa 500 CE, when one of the predominant languages of Britain was Anglo-Saxon or Old English. It's quite likely the word existed prior to this point, but we're wandering into the annals of prehistory, and records are decidedly sketchy. At this time, the English language had gender, and so there were two words, the masculine wicca, which is W-I-C-C-A, pronounced witcher, and the feminine W-I-C-C-E, pronounced witch, so witcher and witch. It's commonly thought that the word equates to sorcerer from the Old French sorcière, itself from the medieval Latin sortiaris or sortieris, if I can say it. My Latin is useless, apologies Donna, meaning one who sorts or influences the fates and fortunes. However, given that medieval Latin had very little influence over the Old English of the Anglo-Saxons, we think it's worth digging a little deeper. Consider, if you will, Wicca as in Wicca work, where a knowledgeable and skilled craftsman bends and weaves simple wooden twigs together to create a functional object, such as a basket or a chair. The word Wicca has exactly the same Old English root. Hence, we tend to think the word Wicca is somewhat more appropriately translated as one who influences fate and fortune by bending, shaping, and weaving the very fabric of reality. Should I say that again? One who influences fate and fortune by bending, shaping, and weaving the very fabric of reality. To achieve this aim requires not just knowledge, but the wisdom of how that knowledge is applied. Wicca truly is the craft of the wise. So in summary, in this chapter, What's with Wicca? We've given you a brief insight into the nature of Wicca and the origins of this natural neo-pagan religion. We've introduced you to just a few of the people who helped the craft on the wise become what it is today. You have learned that although drawing upon ancient wisdom, Wicca itself only really came into being in the latter half of the 19th century. Nonetheless, the craft of the wise encompasses, honours and celebrates the very nature of nature itself. To dedicate oneself to walk upon this well-worn path is to commit to following in the footsteps of those who trod before us, accepting our responsibility for our own actions and learning respect for our Mother Earth and all living things, including those on the path behind us. This is not a journey for the faint-hearted. There will no doubt be times where you question yourself and doubt if it's even worth the effort. For our part, we can only say that it's about the journey, not the destination. And this is the most incredible journey you will ever take. The road may be hard at times, but those ahead of you on the path will always reach back and lend a hand to help you over the hard scrabble.